My name is Diego Morales, and I have everything a man could want, or so people believe. I own one of the largest business empires in the country, a sprawling mansion, fast cars, and power at my fingertips. Yet, if you stood inside my home, you would hear nothing but silence, a silence so loud it sometimes echoed through my bones. My days were mechanical, early mornings, endless meetings, and lonely dinners. And when the sun set, I would return to the one place I couldn't escape, my mansion, a grand yet lifeless tomb. The only sound that broke the stillness was my mother's voice. Dona Carmen, once a lively woman with a love for music, now spent her days confined to a room upstairs, her memories stolen by the cruel hands of Alzheimer's. Some days, she didn't even know who I was. Diego, Rosario, our housekeeper, said softly one evening as I sat staring at a half-empty plate. Dona Carmen asked for you again today. A wave of guilt washed over me. I had been avoiding her more and more lately. Her vacant stares and disjointed words were too much to bear. I stood, loosening my tie. I'll see her now. In her room, bathed in the golden glow of the lamp, my mother sat by the window, staring into nothingness. I kneeled beside her, taking her frail hand. "Mom, it's me. It's Diego," I whispered. Her eyes flickered toward me, recognition struggling to surface. "Diego," she said faintly, her voice like a soft breeze. But then the light faded, and she returned to her distant world. I stayed there a while, whispering stories she'd long forgotten, hoping she might hear me in that unreachable place. That night, I couldn't stand the walls closing in on me. I grabbed my coat and left the house, heading toward the woods surrounding the estate. Walking through the dense forest had become my habit, a way to escape the suffocating emptiness. But as I ventured deeper, I heard something strange, a faint, muffled sob. I froze. Turning my head, I followed the sound until I saw her. A small figure huddled beneath an old oak tree, her tiny shoulders trembling. A little girl, no older than 8, sat on the cold ground in torn clothes, her face streaked with tears. "Hey," I said softly, stepping closer. She flinched but didn't run. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. What's your name?" The girl wiped her eyes with dirty hands. "Isabella," she whispered. I crouched down to meet her gaze. "Isabella, what are you doing out here alone?" "I got lost," she said, her voice breaking. "My house is gone." "Where's your family?" I asked, though the sinking feeling in my chest told me the answer. "I don't have one." Her words were simple, but they hit me like a dagger. Without thinking, I reached out a hand. "Come with me, Isabella. You'll be safe." She hesitated, eyeing me warily. I tried to smile, though I didn't know how convincing I looked. "I promise. You won't have to sleep in the cold tonight." Finally, she took my hand, her tiny fingers curling around mine. I led her back through the woods, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking through the shadows alone. The moment Isabella stepped into my mansion, she froze. Her wide eyes darted around the grand hall, taking in the marble floors, the sweeping staircase, and the towering walls adorned with lifeless paintings. "Is this a castle?" she whispered, clutching her small arms around herself. "Not quite," I said with a faint smile. To her, I'm sure it seemed like one. But to me, it was a prison built of luxury. "Rosario," I called. The housekeeper appeared, her expression a mix of surprise and concern when she saw Isabella. "Draw a bath and find some clean clothes for her." Rosario frowned. "Mr. Diego, who is this child?" "She's staying here for now," I replied firmly. "Please do as I say." Rosario sighed but nodded. As Isabella was led away, I sank into the leather armchair by the fireplace, staring into the flames. What was I doing? Bringing a lost girl into my home was not part of my calculated, structured life. But when I looked at her, so fragile, so alone, I couldn't turn away. That night, after Isabella was settled in one of the guest rooms, I knocked softly on her door. She opened it cautiously, now dressed in one of my mother's old sweaters that swallowed her small frame. "Is everything okay?" I asked. She nodded but didn't speak. Her big eyes held a question she was too afraid to ask. I knelt down again, my voice soft. You don't have to worry anymore, Isabella. You're safe here. Thank you, she whispered, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. As I turned to leave, she asked, Do you live here alone? My mother lives here too, I said after a pause. But she's not well. Isabella tilted her head. Is she sad? The simplicity of her question caught me off guard. I suppose she is, I replied honestly. I know how that feels, Isabella said softly, to be sad and alone. Those words stayed with me long after I left her room. Alone. Yes, I knew that feeling well. The next morning, as I sat in my study going through work emails, I heard something unusual, soft laughter echoing through the halls. Laughter hadn't been heard in this house for years. I followed the sound and found Isabella in the living room, crouched beside an old, dust-covered piano. Her fingers were pressing random keys, creating a broken melody. You like music? I asked, leaning against the doorway. She jumped, startled, but then nodded. My dad taught me to play a little before she trailed off, her gaze falling. I approached the piano and wiped away some of the dust. My mother loved music. She used to play every evening. Isabella looked up at me. Where is she now? Upstairs, I said, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. She's sick. She doesn't remember much anymore. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then, with a determination I didn't expect, she asked, Can I see her? I hesitated, but something about the earnestness in her eyes made me relent. Okay, I said, but be gentle with her. As we entered Donna Carmen's room, Isabella approached my mother with quiet steps. Hi, she said softly. I'm Isabella. My mother didn't respond. She stared out the window, lost in her fog of memories. Isabella turned to me. Can she hear music? I nodded. Sometimes, I think she does. To my surprise, Isabella sat on the edge of the chair and began to hum, a soft, sweet tune that filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. And then, for just a moment, my mother's eyes flickered with something. Recognition? Peace? I wasn't sure, but it was more than I'd seen in years. Tears pricked my eyes as I watched Isabella gently hold my mother's hand, humming the melody over and over. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel empty. Isabella's presence in my mother's room became a quiet ritual. Every morning, I would find her sitting by Donna Carmen, humming those soft melodies or reading aloud passages from old books she had found in the mansion's library. Though my mother rarely responded, something about Isabella's voice seemed to bring fleeting peace to her troubled mind. One afternoon, as I worked in my office, Isabella appeared in the doorway, her small hands clutching something to her chest. Diego, I found this in a box under your mom's bed. She held out an old leather-bound notebook, its edges worn and the binding fragile with age. I recognized it immediately. It was my mother's journal, her thoughts and dreams written in elegant, looping handwriting. For years, I'd avoided it, unwilling to open those pages and see the woman she had been before the illness stole her away. Can I read it to you? Isabella asked, her eyes hopeful. I hesitated, but finally nodded. All right. We sat together in the drawing room, sunlight filtering through the tall windows as Isabella opened the journal. Her voice was soft and steady as she read aloud. Today, I finished writing the lullaby for Diego. I hope it will bring him comfort long after I'm gone. He doesn't know it yet, but music will always be my way of reaching him, no matter where life takes us. The words hit me like a wave, breaking down a wall I didn't know I had built. I closed my eyes, remembering a time when my mother would play her guitar, the melodies drifting through the house like a warm embrace. Back then, life had been simple, filled with laughter, music, and love. Your mom loved you a lot, Isabella said softly, closing the journal. She wrote so many songs for you. Her words stirred something deep inside me, a longing I'd buried beneath years of work and loneliness. She did, I said quietly, and I pushed all of it away. Isabella tilted her head. Why? I looked at her, this child who had somehow found a way into my heart. Because when she got sick, I couldn't bear to remember who she was before. It hurt too much. Isabella was silent for a moment, then said, "But maybe remembering her is what will make her happy now." Her innocence and wisdom caught me off guard. I realized she was right. My mother might not remember the past, but that didn't mean I couldn't honor it. The following evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I ventured into the music room, a room I had locked away after my mother's diagnosis. Dust covered every surface, and the grand piano stood silent, forgotten. I ran my fingers over the keys, feeling the weight of their stillness. Isabella appeared beside me, her eyes wide with excitement. "Can you play?" "It's been a long time," I admitted. But as I sat down and pressed the first key, the notes came back to me like an old friend. Slowly, I began to play the lullaby my mother had composed for me. Isabella watched in awe, swaying gently to the melody. When I finished, she clapped her hands. "That was beautiful. Your mom would be so proud." I smiled, a real smile that felt foreign but wonderful. "Thank you, Isabella. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten." "Can you teach me?" she asked eagerly, her small fingers hovering above the keys. For the next hour, I guided Isabella. The room that had been silent for so long was alive again. The rich notes of the piano filled the air, flowing through the mansion like whispers of the past. I sat beside Isabella as she tried to imitate the chords I played. Her tiny hands fumbled over the keys, but her determination was unwavering. Every wrong note was followed by a giggle, and every successful chord earned a wide, triumphant smile. "Here, try this again," I said patiently, placing my hands over hers to show her the proper positioning. Her fingers trembled slightly, but this time, the sound that came out was correct, simple and sweet, as if the instrument itself had been waiting for her touch. I glanced at her, unable to hide my pride. "Perfect, Isabella. You're learning quickly." "Really?" Her face lit up like a sunrise. "I've always wanted to play something real. My dad, he used to sing to me, but we didn't have a piano. We didn't have much of anything." I stopped, the joy in the room suddenly overshadowed by the weight of her words. "Your father, he taught you music?" Isabella nodded, her expression softening as she looked at the keys. "He said music is like magic. It makes sad days feel better and happy days feel brighter. He taught me to sing, but she paused, swallowing hard. After he went away, I didn't sing anymore. It hurt too much." Her voice cracked, and I felt my chest tighten. How much loss had this little girl already endured? Her childhood was worlds apart from mine. Mine had been filled with music and love until my mother's illness changed everything. But hers had been a constant battle for survival. I placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Music is magic," I agreed quietly. "And sometimes, when we share it, it can heal the parts of us we thought were broken." Isabella looked up at me with those wide, hopeful eyes, searching my face as if she were trying to decide if I truly meant it. Then, with a small, determined nod, she whispered, "Can we play the song you played for me last night? The one your mom wrote for you?" I hesitated. That song, the lullaby my mother had composed, was sacred. It belonged to memories I tried to bury for years, but something in Isabella's voice broke through my walls. Slowly, I nodded. "All right, but this time, you'll sing." Her face paled slightly. "Me? But I haven't sung in forever." "You don't have to be perfect," I reassured her. "Just sing from here." I placed a hand over my heart, earning a shy smile. We began again, the piano's soft melody filling the air. At first, Isabella hummed hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. But as the music carried her, the hesitation faded, and she began to sing. Softly at first, then louder, clearer. Her voice, though young and fragile, was beautiful. It carried the innocence of a child and the strength of someone who had lived through more than she should have. The words my mother had written so many years ago came to life again. "In your eyes, I find my light, like stars that shine through endless night. Though miles may part and time may fly, my love for you will never die." Tears pricked at my eyes as Isabella sang, her voice trembling on the final note. The mansion, this cavernous, lonely place, felt warmer than it had in decades. For the first time, I could almost see my mother sitting by the piano, her hands moving effortlessly over the keys, smiling at me as she played. When the final note faded, Isabella turned to me nervously. Was it okay? I couldn't speak for a moment, my throat tight with emotion. Finally, I nodded, brushing a tear from my cheek. It was perfect, Isabella. Her face broke into a grin, and without warning, she threw her arms around me. Thank you for teaching me, Diego. I feel like my dad would be happy to hear me sing again. I froze for a moment before wrapping my arms around her small frame. The walls I had built around my heart, walls that had been impenetrable for years, were crumbling with every day Isabella spent here. She had given me something I didn't realize I'd been missing. A sense of purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning that wasn't tied to business or obligation. That night, as I stood in the doorway of Isabella's temporary room, watching her sleep, I made a decision. Her face, peaceful and untroubled, was a stark contrast to the frightened girl I had found in the woods. She belonged here. She deserved a home, love, and the safety she'd been denied for so long. The next morning, I summoned Rosario to my office. I want to talk to you about Isabella. Rosario raised an eyebrow, as she often did when she thought I was making a hasty decision. What about her, sir? I've decided to adopt her. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Rosario's mouth fell open slightly, and for once, she seemed at a loss for words. Adopt her? Sir, that's not something you decide overnight. I didn't decide overnight, I replied calmly. I've thought about it, and I know it's the right thing to do. Isabella has no one. She needs a family, and I hesitated, searching for the right words. I need her too. Rosario's expression softened, and after a long pause, she nodded. You're a good man, Mr. Diego, but are you ready for what this means? Adopting a child isn't a temporary arrangement. It's forever. I know, I said firmly, and I want it to be forever. That afternoon, I told Isabella my plan. We were sitting in the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and the sound of birdsong. Isabella, I began carefully, how would you feel if this became your home, for good? She looked up at me, confused. For good. I nodded. I want to adopt you, Isabella. I want you to be part of my family. Her eyes widened, her mouth falling open in shock. Adopt me? Yes. My voice softened. You deserve a real home, Isabella. A place where you don't have to worry about being alone or hungry or scared ever again. I want to give that to you. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. I began to worry that I had overstepped, that perhaps she didn't want me to fill the role her father had left behind. But then, tears welled in her eyes, and she whispered, You really mean it? I do, I said, my voice thick with emotion. A smile, one brighter than any I had seen before, spread across her face, and she launched herself into my arms, holding on to me tightly. Thank you, Diego. Thank you. In that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. For years, I had lived alone in a house filled with memories and shadows. But now, with Isabella, I could see a new future, one filled with laughter, music, and love. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. The days following Isabella's joyful agreement were a whirlwind of emotions and preparations. I contacted my legal team to begin the adoption process, wanting everything to be official as soon as possible. Isabella's excitement was contagious. She spent her days exploring the mansion as though it were already her permanent home, running from room to room with wide-eyed wonder. Diego, she called one morning from the library, where she had perched herself on a leather armchair much too large for her small frame. If I live here forever, do I get to read all these books? I smiled, leaning against the doorway. You can read as many as you'd like. They're yours now, too. Her face lit up, and she grabbed a book off the nearest shelf, flipping through its pages as though each one held a treasure. It struck me then how little she had had before coming here. Every new experience seemed like a miracle to her, something to cherish, something to celebrate. It made me realize how much I had taken for granted in my own life. Despite the growing sense of family within the mansion, there were still moments of tension. Rosario, ever the pragmatist, hovered over Isabella's every move, ensuring she didn't get too comfortable while the paperwork was still in progress. "Mr. Diego," Rosario said one evening as I reviewed documents in my study, "she's a wonderful child, but don't you think you're rushing this? What if it's too much for her, or for you?" I sighed, putting down my pen and turning to face her. "Rosario, I've spent years in this house with nothing but my regrets and my mother's fading memories. Isabella is the first light I've had in a long time. I'm not rushing anything. I'm giving both of us a chance at a better life." Rosario's expression softened, though her lips pressed into a thin line as she nodded. "If this is what you want, I'll support you. But you know as well as I do that families aren't built overnight. There will be challenges." "I know," I replied, "and I'm ready for them." That night, I tucked Isabella into bed for the first time since making the adoption decision. She clutched the edges of her blanket, her face glowing with contentment. "Good night, Diego," she said, her voice soft. "And thank you for everything." "Good night, Isabella," I replied, my chest tightening with an unfamiliar emotion. As I turned off the light and closed the door, I realized it was pride. Pride in the family we were beginning to build. The adoption process took weeks, but every step brought us closer together. Isabella spent more time with my mother, singing her songs and playing the guitar she had found in the wardrobe. It was as though music was their shared language, a bridge connecting two souls across the chasm of illness. One afternoon, as Isabella sang the lullaby my mother had written for me, something remarkable happened. My mother, who had spent much of the day in her usual unresponsive state, lifted her head and smiled. "Diego," she said softly, her voice trembling with effort. "That song. I wrote it for you." I froze, the words hitting me like a tidal wave. "Yes, Mama," I whispered, kneeling beside her. "You did." Her hand, frail and shaking, reached for mine. "You've grown into such a fine man. And now you're giving this little girl a home." Tears blurred my vision as I held her hand tightly. "I'm trying, Mama. I'm trying to make you proud." "You already have," she murmured, her voice fading. "Take care of her. And take care of yourself." Her eyes fluttered closed, and the moment passed. But the weight of her words stayed with me, a reminder of the love she had always shown me, and the love I now had the chance to pass on to Isabella. The day the adoption was finalized, I threw a small celebration in the garden. It was just the three of us, my mother, Isabella, and me. Rosario, true to her practical nature, stood nearby with a tray of drinks, watching us with a small but genuine smile. "Do I get to call you Dad now?" Isabella asked as she twirled in her new dress, the sunlight catching the joy in her eyes. I laughed, my heart swelling. "You can call me whatever you'd like, Isabella." "Okay, Dad," she shouted, running toward me and throwing her arms around my waist. For the first time in years, the mansion felt alive. Laughter echoed through the halls, and music filled the rooms once again. Isabella's presence had transformed not just the house, but my heart. As I tucked her into bed that night, she looked up at me with a thoughtful expression. "Diego, Dad," she corrected herself, grinning. "Do you think my dad would be proud of me?" I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Isabella, I know he would. And so am I." Her smile was soft, but her eyes glistened with tears. "I'm glad I found you in the woods that night," she whispered. "So am I," said, my voice breaking slightly. As I left her room and walked down the hall, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The mansion, once a place of sorrow and solitude, was now a home filled with love and hope. Isabella wasn't just my adopted daughter. She was my second chance, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always light waiting to be found.